thanks everyone for joining us this morning on our conversation about nuclear innovation, decarbonization, and economic justice. I'm really pleased you can join us. I'm really happy to be able to host today's speakers. We've got 4 speakers today. I'll give you a little bit of the history and setup, but glad to welcome Denia Djokić from the University of Michigan, Suzy Baker, who is the Executive Director of the Good Energy Collective, and of course, very strong historical ties to the University of Michigan, and we will forever think of her as one of us. Başak Saraç-Lesavre from the University of Manchester, and then Aditi Verma, who is at the University of Michigan, but on loan to Harvard. So that's kind of like Premier League soccer for Europeans, right? She's on loan, building up her capabilities till we bring her back to the main team, right? Starting in the fall of 2022. Okay. The history behind this, hopefully you've seen that the journal Issues in Science and Technology this past spring put out 3 separate papers simultaneously around the issues that we're going to talk about this morning. Is really at the intersection of looking at historically some of the things that the nuclear energy community has done, practices that we've sort of made common that may actually be limiting our ability to deploy the technology, right? And they're really things at the intersection of social science and technology. And so I'm really pleased to have these 4 young scholars here today because if you've read the pieces, they're great. And I think they're very timely and open up an important conversation. So what I'd like to do to get things started is I'll ask each, I should say for the audience, we've got 90 minutes set aside. And we're going to try to make this very conversational. I've encouraged the 4 to, as quickly as they can, start ignoring the moderator and having an interesting conversation about their work. Matt Wald's asking, can we put a link to the pieces in the chat box? And we're going to do that as part of the conversation. So thanks, Matt. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists just to give a brief introduction, and then we're going to try to make this very conversational. Try to set aside roughly 20 minutes-ish at the end to look at some of the questions you may have. So feel free to put them in the chat. I will keep trying to keep track of those and get to as many of the interesting ones as we can. So we'll start with a little quick introduction, and I'll just ask each of the panelists to briefly introduce yourself and the motivation for releasing the piece that you did. And when we're done with that, I'll explain to you how these all came together as one thing, which is kind of an interesting history and maybe timely important. So I will randomly do this in reverse alphabetical order of the last name. So Aditi, please introduce yourself and what was your motivation for writing the piece you did?
Sure. Thank you, Todd, so much for having us here with you today. I'm so glad that we're all together on the same screen, even if not all in person. So I'm Aditi Verma. I'm a research scientist at the moment in the Department of Nuclear Engineering and Radiological Sciences, and a visiting scholar at Harvard at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. And next fall, I will be an assistant professor in the department. So I'm very, very excited to get started, or I guess I've already started. So that's my introduction. I guess I should say I am a nuclear engineer by training. My degrees are in nuclear engineering, but I'm a bit of an unusual nuclear engineer in that, at least for my doctoral work, I had a committee that was the committee that advised my research was made up in equal parts of both engineers and social scientists. And that was important to me because in my work, I study design. I study how reactor designers, nuclear reactor designers make decisions in the very, very early stages of design, and how the decisions that they make about risk, about safety, about cost, or even how they think about how to frame the design problems that they should be working on, how that ultimately shapes the system that is designed. And that sort of leads me to why I felt this piece was so important to write. I think my intellectual trajectory through nuclear engineering as a discipline has sort of always been an unusual one, in that I've always been drawn to the humanities and the social sciences. And I felt that those disciplines gave me ways of thinking about nuclear engineering and about the things that I was learning and doing and thinking about, that nuclear engineering itself was not providing me as part of my training and education at MIT. And so then when I met Denia, which was 2 years ago now, we sort of had this epiphany / very interesting realization that in many ways we shared sort of the same perceptions of or critiques of the field. We felt that there had been something missing in our education and training within the nuclear engineering departments. And so we wrote this piece as a call to action to our field to sort of hopefully get nuclear engineers to think about what is perhaps missing from the field and what could be added to it. And I hope that this piece that we've written, in which we write about the ways in which nuclear engineering can become a more epistemically expansive discipline that brings in ways of thinking and knowing from the humanities and the social sciences, to train nuclear engineers to better engage and grapple with the ethical, moral, social dilemmas that are created by the development and use of nuclear technologies. We hope that the call to action in our piece is perceived as a constructive one, because that is really what it is. You know, nuclear engineering is still a relatively young discipline. It's evolved over the last 5 or 6 decades by sort of bringing in ways of knowing from other science and engineering disciplines. And in a sense, nuclear engineering continues to evolve. And so I think what we see our piece as doing is sort of maybe pushing the intellectual bounds of nuclear engineering a bit more and inviting nuclear engineers to continue to build and develop the field by continuing to bring in these ways of thinking and knowing that have been missing from our discipline, but which we can now add to enrich our ways of thinking and enrich our practice. So I'll stop rambling there.
All right, no, great. That's a very nice introduction. Okay, so to continue, reverse alphabetical order by last name, Başak.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's a great pleasure. I'm a Science and Technology Studies scholar at the University of Manchester in the Department of Social Anthropology, and also a member of the Beam Nuclear and Social Science Network, which is part of the Dalton Nuclear Institute. And I'm a political scientist by training and not a nuclear engineer. And my research is situated at the interface of science and technology studies, human geography, nuclear anthropology, and economic sociology. And what I am passionate about is the ways in which contemporary societies define their roles and responsibilities towards the present and future generations. Translation of those into political and moral arrangements and controversies such arrangements generate and tests they undergo over time. So with this idea, I have studied historically, ethnographically, the US nuclear waste policy and nuclear waste program. And I think that it is important at this stage in time, while we are discussing the potential contribution of nuclear energy to climate change mitigation and all these things, that we also draw attention to the potential socioeconomic, political, and environmental injustices that the use of technology has generated or is like to generate. So it was also important for me to draw attention to some of the new facilities that are being, cited, and how they could be cited better so that we have more morally and politically desirable nuclear waste future and nuclear future. So I think, that's the most important, point I would like to make. Yeah.
Right, great, thanks, appreciate it. Next up, Denia.
Thanks, Todd. Hi, everyone. Thank you also for having me here today. Aditi, thank you for silver plattering our piece in such an eloquent way. And Başak, to answer Todd's question, I'll just say to Başak, I wish I had known you during graduate school because, and it'll make sense why I say that in a minute. So like Aditi, I have a PhD in nuclear engineering. I started my PhD, this is important to mention, I started my PhD in 2005, which was sort of the heyday of the nuclear renaissance. The GNEP program had just been announced that year. A couple years later, I became an Office of Civilian Radioactive Waste Management Fellow because I had originally become or joined the graduate program at UC Berkeley, nuclear engineering, to specifically study radioactive waste management. As based on what Başak was just saying, like as the nuclear renaissance was gaining momentum and there was a lot of narratives and yeah, just a lot of conversation around nuclear energy being one of the key components in climate change, the fight against climate change. So I joined thinking, okay, well, we have to figure out this radioactive waste management piece because clearly this has not been solved yet. So that was graduate school version of me. And then over the years, I sort of developed an understanding, but only really an intuitive understanding, and I didn't really have the vocabulary or the intellectual tools to describe what I was witnessing, which was, especially working under the auspices of Akram, which was in charge of the Yucca Mountain Project in the US. Keep in mind, this was, if anybody in the audience knows the nuclear waste management history, if they've read Başak's piece, they'll know that we were supposed to, in the US, ship all commercial and some military spent nuclear fuel to Yucca Mountain at the end of the 90s, but this was already mid 2000s. It hasn't happened. Thank you, Başak. So there was clearly something off, right? And so I started going down the trail of like, what's going on? And so I started learning about the socio-political dimensions, not just the technical dimensions of radioactive waste management. I started with, modeling of radionuclide transport. Actually, no, my colleagues were doing that. I was doing more waste canister loading modeling at the time, and taking all these classes where we would basically solve a whole bunch of diffusion equations to try and understand geologic transport of radionuclides as they were released in these, models of waste canisters inside the mountain, et cetera, But of course, it was clear that this was not the whole story. So fast forward to 2009, and I say that because it was before 2011, so before Fukushima, there was a really pivotal summer in my graduate student, in my tenure as a graduate student, where I joined a summer school that was meant with the objective of teaching social scientific literacy to nuclear engineers. And that was really one of the first inklings I've had of we nuclear engineers are missing something. We're missing something in our pedagogies, in our curriculum. And it was a really enlightening summer school. I won't go into that, but I'm happy to talk about it. 2 years later, we had one on Fukushima for obvious reasons, because it was a few months after the earthquake, tsunami, and triple reactor meltdown. And so all that is to illustrate the personal path that I took to write this piece, if you want to frame it that way, started over a decade ago. And it was even pre-Fukushima where I, from the inside, realized just how many complex components we nuclear engineers did not understand and really needed to understand. So for me personally, this piece was sort of a reparative project. Like, what do I wish I had known then, or I had access to then, that I would love the nuclear engineers of today and tomorrow to also have the right to know and to learn. I guess I could put it that way. And I should say, it's not just nuclear engineers. I mean, it's, everyone in sort of the nuclear spaces. But as Aditi and I came from that curriculum, we wrote it through that lens.
Okay, awesome, thanks. And one more intro, and that's Suzy.
Thanks, Todd. Gosh, I'm so happy to be here with this group of amazing women. Thank you for convening us. So I had sort of like the opposite experience. Like we've got a bunch of engineers who came to sort of the social sciences. And I actually started off in the art world. So I studied sculpture and public art. And early in my career, worked for an artist who is renowned for his place-based public art. That's really at the nexus of sort of public health and policy. And so I had access to this really cool, dynamic, emergent tool belt and decided to bring that tool belt to the issue of climate change. And so I was in my early 20s when I kind of figured out that I wanted to work on nuclear and climate change, and spent a bunch of years working in community with host communities. So ranging from mining and milling to energy facilities, national labs, folks who are doing work on legacy weapons, contemporary weapons, waste management, the whole gamut of folks who host and benefit from and are also sometimes negatively impacted by nuclear technologies. And in that time, I observed a lot of variation in the ways in which these facilities either did or did not have positive relationships with their community and or had outside opposition. You know, there are just a lot of different dynamics at play. And I just started to wonder, why do we see this variation, right? Like, how did we get such different, dramatically different outcomes where you will have an energy facility that is beloved and hosting community events and has all these high paying jobs. And then you might have a lab facility where you've got folks up in arms and protesting and trying to shut down transport for different R&D projects. And so that was sort of the beginning of my path to realizing that a lot of the answers to those questions really lie in federal policy. And so I slowly sort of, I'm not an academic by training. I'm definitely a practitioner and experiential learner. And so I've sort of been able to gain access to a bunch of different sort of parts of the sector and to work and learn through working and chipping away at different problems, and have come to recently, about a year ago, found an NGO called Good Energy Collective with Dr. Jessica Levering, who couldn't be here with us because she's on maternity leave, yay, healthy baby. And so she and I, decided, we wanted to carve out a space to really think about federal policy at the nexus of environmental justice and how that plays into the sort of broader conversation about nuclear and climate change, and to think about sort of the subject of the article at hand for this panel, which is sort of the case for local control over not just facility siting, but perhaps even the facilities themselves, and especially with energy facilities. And so that piece was sort of the start of a whole bunch of policy work that's still underway, and trying to work out how can we sort of engineer better outcomes for communities and better outcomes for the technology and better outcomes for the climate. Can we sort of create that win-win-win scenario for folks where we're doing this in a way that's aligned with our values and aligned with community needs? So that is my story, and I'll throw it back to Todd to ask us some more questions.
All right, thanks. And thanks, Suzy, for noting that Jessica was the 5th author that was associated with these pieces. And it just shows the old adage, if you take 5 people randomly, one of them is doing important things and the others are sitting around chatting about stuff. So there you go. So what's interesting about this conversation, I think, is that there's so many, such a pathway of personal growth in it. And I would just like to point out, for those of you that don't know what Fastest Path to Zero is, right, when I came to University of Michigan, Suzy and I got together and started this. And And honestly, for me, it was this realization that all I ever see from my community is technology studies, and there's probably more to that without necessarily understanding what that was. And now 2 years later, I'm like really fortunate to host really cool discussions between smart people that are bringing clarity to what that means. So it's awesome. All right. I thought what was interesting about this, the three pieces being released in issues at the same time, which I actually didn't understand until this morning. I always thought it was, okay, there was this coordinated effort, all these scholars knew each other, and they said, let's write pieces together. And it turns out they were separately writing three separate pieces, right? And the editor of issues said, this is important, let me figure out how to gather these together and make it seem more collective. And I think that's pretty good editorial work from issues. But I'm just curious, and you can answer in sort of whatever order, is there a sense that, I mean, this editor, right, sort of said, this seems to be an issue of its time, all right? And I'm just wondering what you think about that. I mean, is it the start of a new look at how we do nuclear energy design, deployment, operations, right? Are we at sort of an interesting point in time? Yeah, just curious your opinions on that. Yeah, Suzy, we'll go reverse alphabetical.
Oh, good. I'll just keep talking. I mean, I think yes, just from my perch in DC, we're entering a completely high stakes, new, and hopefully positive sort of political paradigm where we're taking climate change seriously, finally. And if we can get this reconciliation through, there's going to be a ton of money to tackle it. And so with that also come new frameworks and paradigms for thinking about communities, thinking about environmental justice, thinking about the epistemologies that are going to be needed to actually problem solve this. And it does demand of not just the nuclear sector, but of everyone to like all hands on deck. We need to get this right. This is potentially really transformative. This is going to be our infrastructure for the next 50 to 100 years that we're about to put in place in the next 20 years. And so, yeah, I think this is like the moment for everyone to really show up and do their very best work.
Yeah, thanks. Well, I'll get back to that, but I've got another question that I think plays off that later. So maybe Denia, your comments on, are we at a point in time?
I wasn't ready to answer this question. I am, I guess I would say that from a social consciousness perspective, we're at a really auspicious moment to really radically rethink not just how we go forward with nuclear energy, but as Suzy said, how we take climate change seriously and how we really do it right. And that includes energy technologies, but it doesn't only include energy technologies, right? And this is Suzy's wheelhouse in DC, like how is the DC ecosystem thinking about all the things, all the pieces, jobs, you know, not just like where do we deploy what, but how do we change policies, practices, and systems to really get to the root of the drivers of climate change. And I promise I'm not going to go on an anti-capitalist rant, but that's also, you know, that's a big piece of it. But as for nuclear energy specifically, I think that I'm very heartened by how our sector, as also instantiated by Todd and Suzy bringing me on to Fastest Path. I was doing kind of STSE work at the Belfer Center where Aditi is now, and at the Kennedy School more broadly, at the STS program there. And they sort of found me and they were like, wait a second, like, come to Fastest Path and help us think about this. And yeah, thank you, Aditi, for that. And I illustrate that moment of them finding me as sort of a very, very tiny instance or example of the nuclear sector as a whole, like really wanting to get the equity and justice piece right, writ large. I'm kind of waving my hands as I say this because we have yet to define what that means for the nuclear sector. But I think that I get the heartening impression that everyone is willing, and in the spirit of all hands on deck in the nuclear sector, everyone's just like trying to understand and map out the problem, trying to understand historical legacies and injustices that have been committed by the nuclear field writ large over the last 70 years, things that we don't have anything personally to do with necessarily, but we're really trying to face it and have a reckoning with it, trying to understand how past processes in nuclear facility siting have gone wrong, whose voices have been heard, whose voices haven't, how are risks and benefits, how have they been distributed historically. And since we're at this crossroads, or I would call it a crossroads, both in terms of taking climate change seriously, as Suzy said, but also in terms of, we've just gone through a really, really tough and intense year and a half. And I think we've, as a society, just kind of grappled with a lot of, multi-century injustices that we haven't necessarily until now really faced. I mean, I say that knowing that there have actually been moments in history, in modern history and 20th century history that have sort of come really close, but I think in general this is unprecedented on a global scale, and what that means for the nuclear field is just a lot of hope that we could get it right, both past, present, and future this time around.
All right, cool.
Denia,
Thanks.
sorry, can I respond really quickly? I dropped in the chat and then I was like, that's not that helpful. That at minimum, we at least now have a mandate to unpack the EJ implications. The work isn't done. And so I want to apologize if I implied that the mandate itself was enough to move forward. There's a lot in between, a lot of work in between that's yet to be done.
Yeah, and I think that's important to point out. I think the fact that we haven't had a mandate yet, like there have been, and thank you, this plays into my sort of recognition of there have been justice movements. There is a lot of work that has been done for so long, and it just hasn't had the mandate, as Suzy says, to trickle up to the highest levels of government. And when I say tough year and a half, I really mean to backtrack some 5.5 years, let's say, or wherever you want to draw the boundaries is up to you. But I think that the Biden administration has, there's a lot of whiplash from the Trump years, where I think the mandate has really finally strongly been delivered. Yeah, not to harp on your point, Suzy. I think I just wanted to re-underline what you were underlining. And now the work can finally begin, and all these people that have been doing this work for decades and writing about it and being on the streets, they can finally actually bring it to the highest levels of policy. And I think that's amazing.
All right, thanks. Başak, maybe your comment on, is this a moment in time? And especially since you sit in a different country, in the UK, do you see anything different, similar over there to what you watch us doing here in the US?
I think in the US, there's a more vivid conversation about these issues, especially regarding the nuclear sector. But I mean, there are, we are a little bit moving forward. For instance, in the UK now, there's a whole effort to cite the nuclear waste repository based on voluntarism, and there's a whole committee in charge of finding the voluntary communities and providing them with the research funds so that they can also be part of the decision-making process. So there is an evolution there. But in terms of, acknowledgement of different kinds of injustices, and I think it's not the same history either. So there is not, there is not the same history, it's a different country. So I don't think that there will ever be this kind of awakening in the UK as the one we see in the US. But from my perspective, what is important with nuclear waste and its governance is the fact that it has always been construed as an intergenerational problem. So since the 1970s, even before international agreements started saying that we need to take care of the present and future generations and it's our duty. So in the sense that there was a nuclear waste policy that aimed at protecting present and future generations, and there was a sense of moral and political engagement, and whatever it's failed and all the things that went wrong, there was a willingness and there were some principles that were set up. So even before anyone was discussing Anthropocene or climate change. So now I find it extremely, frustrating, a little sad as well that the management of nuclear waste is where it is today, while the whole world is moving forward towards what can we do for communities, geographies, and geologies, and how we can remediate the mistakes we have done and all these things. So I felt the urge to write this piece and to grab attention to the fact that once there were principles, and there can again be some principles based on which we can manage nuclear waste, and it is an exemplary case. In the sense, a historical case, in the sense that we can draw a lot of lessons from this case towards climate change mitigation or environmental pollution mitigation or ocean plastics pollution and all these kinds of issues. Yeah.
All right, awesome, thanks. Last comment on this moment in time question, Aditi.
Sure, Todd. Actually, I also want to go back to your shout out to Dan Sarowitz, the editor of Issues. He was absolutely the dream editor. He's not on this. He's not on this call, but if this is recorded and Dan sees this someday, Dan, you were incredible. I wish I could only work with editors like you for the rest of my life. But as for the moment in time, I think there are several things that are happening, which I think Dan also probably noticed. Issues has always published scholarship at the intersection of technology and policy and at the intersection of nuclear technology and policy. But I think what was probably evident to Dan as he saw these three pieces is that the framing of these discussions at the intersection of nuclear energy and policy, I think, is going through quite a significant shift. And let me try to describe what that shift is. I think for a long time, nuclear engineers have sort of pursued innovation almost for its own sake, as a fundamental good. If we have new nuclear reactors and we build them, we'll avert climate change and we'll save the world. We sort of jump from nuclear to fixing climate change without really thinking about everything that's in the middle. Where are these reactors going to be built and sited? Are they designed in ways that communities might want them? How might they impact the communities where they might be sited? And a number of other questions. We've just sort of skipped that middle part for a long time. But I think the change that's happening in the field is that now we're thinking about those questions. Not just the people on this call, but I think a lot of students are asking themselves this question. And I think some of them are actually here. I saw some names. And so I think it's very important to ask those questions. If we want nuclear energy to have any future, we can't sort of foist nuclear technologies as a potential solution on society. We have to think about whether it makes sense, when it makes sense, and why it makes sense. So I think that is a shift that's happening, where we're changing how we think about what nuclear energy and nuclear technologies are for and why we pursue innovation. It's not an it's not the end, it's the means to an end, it's the possible means to an end. So I think that's a huge shift that's happening now. Another shift that I think is happening, which I think was also evident to Dan, is that for a long time in the nuclear engineering field and in the nuclear sector broadly, there has been this dialogue of public acceptance. If we could just get the public to accept our technologies and accept what we are saying, we would fix everything. And that has just never worked. And the shift that's happening now, which again, I think is mostly being orchestrated by young people and wise sages such as Todd, is that we are shifting from public acceptance to public engagement. We're not going to push our technologies on people. We're going to ask them what makes sense, when it makes sense, and whether it makes sense. And that dialogue needs to be a two-way dialogue, not just about all of the questions I've just listed, but actually bringing in those perspectives into the very early stages of design and engineering, and then citing in the way that Suzy and Jessica talk about in their piece, in the ways in which Başak talks about in her piece. All of these questions need to inform, or all of these considerations need to inform how we think about our technologies from the early stages of design to when we are dismantling them and their waste. And then I think the third change, which Denia and Suzy have been talking about, this focus on environmental justice, this mandate to actually do environmental justice work. I think especially in the last year, those calls have really been amplified. And I think where, as a community, as the nuclear engineering community, we're sort of figuring out what environmental justice really means. I think implicitly, many of us have different definitions and ideas of what it might mean. I think in some cases, I see people sort of taking things they've already been doing and slapping the environmental justice label on it. That's wrong. But there are a lot of people who are truly well-meaning. And I think as part of the conversations that we're having within the sector and within the field now, we actually need to understand and really probe what environmental justice means, not just to us, but to the frontline communities. What does it mean to them? And what would it mean to bring their ways of thinking about environmental justice into our engineering and design practice and into our policy making? And I think that's where Suzy and Jessica with their new organization are really leading the way. And I'm excited to see what they do. And then the fourth thing, which is sort of a repetition, but I'll say it anyway, I think a lot of this change is coming from the students. And that's why I think it's so exciting for young people such as ourselves to be in this field right now, because really the students are calling for a lot of this change and leading the way, and we're following.
Thanks. That's awesome. So I want to follow off, and multiple people sort of hinted at this is discussing this moment in time. But about 2 weeks ago, right, the Department of Energy, Office of Nuclear Energy released its request for research calls. And for the first time I ever recall in my career, they're asking for proposals in these areas, right? They're asking for things in consent-based siting, environmental justice, workforce development. And I'm really curious what you all think of that, right? And the importance of that, the necessity for it becoming integral to what we do. Just any comments you have on the fact that we seem to be pivoting the research organization in a way that you projected we should from your pieces. And in a nod to Suzy and Jessica's piece, I will drop my hierarchical, do it in alphabetical, reverse alphabetical order thing, and let you just jump in whatever order you want. So maybe raise a hand, okay. Free for all. Somebody jump in, or I'm gonna have to do alphabetical order again. You need to cure
I'll jump in. Okay, I wanna circle back to a phrase that Aditi just used that I jotted down very furiously in my notes, but the idea of the shift from public perception being considered the problem at hand that we're dealing with to public engagement being the thing that we need as sort of like a vehicle for improving our relationships with with all kinds of stakeholders. And I see this as a reflection of a deeper understanding, which is that the reason people don't like nuclear is not a science communication problem. It's not that they just don't understand the science well or the facts, and therefore they're scared and it's an illegitimate kind of fear, right? Because that has been a really persistent narrative within the sector for a long, long time, and it has shaped so much work and research and outreach, and we haven't been able to budget. It hasn't worked, right? That framework has fundamentally failed us. And I think that this shift in thinking about the work that needs to be done to successfully engage across a whole spectrum of challenges facing the sector and to really meet the moment, to me, it's like finally this sort of like internalizing of the fact that we're going to have to build a whole new tool belt. We're going to have to bring in all kinds of different expertise. We're going to have to fundamentally change the way that we do business and include more people in order to earn trust. And so that's a shift of responsibility. And this is pulling from many months of conversations with Denia about how we understand who is responsible for doing this work. And it is the responsibility of the government and of the sector and of the nuclear community to work this stuff out and to frame the way that we're working differently. It is not the responsibility of the communities to like get educated or like make, figure out the frameworks. So I think it's just a real shift in like where we think about the work happening and who's doing it and how. And so I was so pleased to see this sort of manifest in the way that we're thinking about what needs to be funded and why, because it's a huge sort of shift. I keep using that word, sorry.
Yeah. Others on that?
I have a thought or 10. I'm gonna borrow from everything that's been said in the last couple of people. Starting with the call, I will say that it is absolutely true that it's unprecedented. It signifies a shift. There's a mandate, all the keywords that we've been throwing around. I will also say, and I mean this in an encouraging way, not in a, hopefully not a curmudgeonly way, but it's also not enough. I think, and I just mean that in a like, awesome, like we're at the start line. Like we've actually like walked a couple of steps. This is amazing. I would really, really love to see, I wish I was on the other side. I would love to see all the proposals coming in. I would love to see sort of the demand for this kind of work. I would also love to see next year around and beyond just the pot of money to fund environmental justice work increasing, so that we can really expand our focus into every single strand of justice work, so we can really elevate the voices, as we've been saying, really center the voices that haven't been heard yet, really as an industry engage voices not from the top of our pedestal and reaching out to them. I want to unpack the public engagement vocabulary a little bit as well, which just like environmental justice, it can mean different things to different people in different sectors of the industry. And I think we have to be very careful about that as well. And I think constant work and funding that work to constantly just unpack and deconstruct, and also, and I just don't mean in an academic theoretical way, I mean that too, but that already all exists. I mean in a on the ground, contextually based, every single project is different. And also we can learn from every single project across the industry, and different communities learn from each other as well. And I think Suzy, you can speak really well to this, of how the similarities and the differences are connected across community experiences. And I lost the beginning of my sentence, but what I'm trying to convey is that I just want to encourage the sector and the government to just keep going. Like, this is great, keep going. This is great, keep going. And I also want to sort of clarify something I said earlier, and in the spirit of keep going, I want to say that there's also I say this a lot and I just can't say this enough. There's a lot of work that already exists. When I said that we don't really understand what that is yet, I meant we, the nuclear sector. We haven't built the knowledge bridges that have been needed to be built ages and ages ago. We're just now understanding the racial dimensions of the injustices perpetuated. I mean, I don't think we've gotten much beyond that, but definitely the class dimensions and the geographical distribution dimensions, which are intertwined with racialized and class identities, or racialized identities and class politics, I should say. And so I really, really want to honor the work that has already been done and say that, reiterate that we need to do work on multiple fronts, bringing that knowledge in, bringing people in, centering the most vulnerable, asking them what they need, both in terms of, hey, community, what kind of energy system do you want? And, hey, community, how have we harmed you? How can we do good by you? How can we help you repair the harms that have been perpetuated? And by we, I mean the nuclear sector, both industry, government, and academia. Like, research should be oriented around this as well, and just pull in these strands from everywhere, because it exists. And I think we can do really amazing work if we are supported to have the time and the space to invite people that have been doing this for years, and also bring in their knowledge to make new knowledge about specific contexts as the nuclear industry moves forward and reckons with its past.
Yeah, Suzy.
I just want to echo something that Denia raised, which is that in the sort of like current dialogue about the integration of EJ principles into nuclear work, the willingness to be like, yes, more people need access to nuclear technology, that's super easy. Everybody's excited to get more people access to technology, and even on their own terms, and to be really creative about that. Folks are really struggling still to grapple with the restorative justice aspects of like legacy issues that still haunt and harm communities in this country. And so I think some aspects of this work feel really sort of easy and empowering and aligned with the work that's already underway, and other parts are tougher and are going to take more reflection and are going to force us as a sector and as a community to do some real introspection that I think is overdue. And so I just wanted to sort of like break down some of what Denia was alluding to in the ways in which it's playing out in my world right now. We can't just do the forward looking thing. Justice inherently asks us to grapple with the legacy of the technology. And so we can't skip that part, unfortunately. We got to deal with that too.
Can I? Oh, sorry.
Sorry,
Yes.
Denia, go.
Yeah, Başak, go ahead.
I just want to, I think there is something, there's a need of making a little nuance here, because it's not only, communities volunteering to receive any kind of nuclear facility against those who have legacy waste or whatever to be dealt with, but, which communities are put in a situation, for instance, to be wanting a nuclear facility? How do we define, our roles and responsibilities towards them if they have been subject to socioeconomic or political or environmental injustices in the past? And at the same time, if, for instance, a community volunteers, then how do we account for the communities surrounding, or the state, or the states, or the transportation routes and all. So I'm just trying to say that, like, you know, there's a whole range of concerned groups to account for, and very different scales. And it is certainly very difficult to come up with a schema or a procedure framework that is pre-given, and it needs to be built case by case, situation by situation. I just want to draw attention to that point that, you know, it's not a dichotomy between, you know, those who have been subject to injustice and those who are wanting, but there's lots of issues in between that we have to deal with.
Yeah, Aditi.
Oh, did Denia have something to say first? I think you were going to respond to something that Suzy had said.
Go ahead. I'll go at the end.
Okay. Well, this is again maybe backtracking a little bit, but I again wanted to do another shout out. I think the reason that we're seeing funding and the mandate to do environmental justice work from the DOE is again because the incredible women who are now sort of leading the way there. And specifically, I want to mention Katie Huff and Ashley Finan, who I think are really changing a lot of things at the DOE and the National Reactor Innovation Center, NRIC, respectively. And I guess to sort of add to what Denia has said, you know, this funding in the current DOE funding opportunity announcement, the work scopes that explicitly mention environmental justice in the context of advanced reactors, in the context of waste facility siting, I think it's a start. It's a great start, but we're going to need a lot more. And I think what's so interesting about the work scopes is that they explicitly call on nuclear engineers to work with their colleagues in the humanities and social sciences. And I think that's an incredible thing that, you know, it's incredible that the work scopes acknowledge this. But what I do want to note is that in order for these intellectual engagements with disciplines that have typically, or colleagues from disciplines that have typically not worked with nuclear engineers, for those intellectual engagements and partnerships to really be sort of durable and long lasting, and for that trust to be built between our disciplines, we need this to be sort of an ongoing program of research and work. And that's only going to be possible if the DOE continues to fund this kind of work. So that is the sort of intellectual longevity of this kind of work that I think makes it important for funding to continue for this kind of work in the future. But then the even more important element, which Suzy and Başak and Denia have already highlighted, is that sort of achieving environmental justice in the nuclear sector is going to be an ongoing project. We're going to have to look back in order to look forward. We're not going to get to a point where we can say, oh, we've achieved environmental justice. That's never going to happen. It's going to be an ongoing project that's probably never going to end, as it should, and that's as it should be. And so all of that is to really get to the point that I'm trying to make, is that for the research that we're about to embark on in this sphere, in, you know, what does it mean to achieve environmental justice in a nuclear context, or what does the path to getting there look like? In order for us to continue to do that work meaningfully, we need to build those intellectual partnerships with our colleagues from other disciplines. And in order for the work itself to continue to be done for a long time so that it has impact, we will continue to need that funding. And so what I hope will happen in the future is that other funding agencies, including foundations, will look at this kind of work, which has implications both for research and also practice. I hope that foundations will increasingly be open to funding this kind of work, because, and we can get into this later if we want to, but I think it, in some ways, for intellectual independence, it would almost help to have some of that funding come from a diversity of sources and not just from the DOE. I think the DOE contribution is invaluable, it's very important, but we also need it to come from elsewhere as well.
Right. Denia.
I will just add quickly to that there's also a very important component of responsibility in the DOE funding this kind of justice work. And so I want to underline that it is important to have the DOE continue to fund this kind of work, but a diversity of funding that allows for independent thought is, I mean, it's central. I think that I wanted to just tie or underline what Başak was saying about the highly contextually, that what justice looks like, or what kind of even the work, community engagement work looks like, is highly contextually dependent. Every local situation has different material, social, cultural, historical fabrics. I think something that I've learned from Suzy is, Piketon, Ohio is very, very different from Nye County, Nevada, or even more of a contrast, the Western Shoshone in that is the tribe that was affected very heavily by the Yucca Mountain Project specifically, and historically also the Nevada test site. And they're of course entangled with each other, those histories. So I think that as I was talking about the racialized dimensions of historical injustices in the nuclear field there, and as Başak was talking about the differences between the UK and the US, I just want to also point out that the US, whereas the UK, more specifically, the UK, let's say, not to get into UK politics, but the Crown has been a colonizer, whereas the US has been both a colonizer and the colonized, right? At least in terms of the geographical area that we now call the United States. And there are very strong colonial dimensions, both globally, but specifically in the US, of the nuclear enterprise ever since its inception. And so when we talk about environmental justice in the nuclear energy field in the United States, it's more than just intergenerational justice. It's really understanding the colonial dimensions in some of the communities that have been harmed by upstream and downstream fuel cycle activities, as well as the Piketon Ohios of the United States that have also been, actually, Suzy, you can talk to this better, but to tie it back to the need for funding, we really need funding to address all the realities of all these local contexts. And I think that only then can we really map out and draw out the complete picture of what the justice work entails, at least in the United States. And there was one more thing I was going to mention, but I forgot. I'll think about it in a minute.
Yeah, well, I saw Başak raise her hand, so she probably knows what you were going to say, so we'll let her answer. Go ahead, Başak. Yeah, you're muted, Sue.
It was just an example about what we are all talking about here. Just like, so I conducted field work in Carlsbad, New Mexico at WIP. So Lea and Eddy County wants more nuclear waste. So they always looked at the capital Albuquerque as the place of progress and modernity and all these things, and now they have a nuclear facility with the jobs and the educated people. They want it to continue. So, and on the other hand, obviously, the state of New Mexico and Indian nations. There are lots of Indian nations that are against the siting of these kind of facilities. So I mean, all these perspectives count in the and there is. And these concerned groups need to be able to hear each other, and we need, in that sense, both of them count. It's what I want to say. So, and it's very tricky to reach to a consent-based decision making when things are like that. But it just takes time. I think there's need to acknowledge that these things take time, as it was the case with WIP. It's it lasted for decades, the siting process. So there's a necessity to acknowledge that these people, concerned groups, can hear each other, but it will just take time to reach a politically and morally desirable arrangement. And in all these different contexts, this was just an example to throw.
Okay. And Suzy, do you have a comment?
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say, one of the things I feel really proud and excited about with Fastest Path is just that it's an entity that's set up specifically to be able to house some of this research, and then to like immediately and almost like seamlessly plug it back into workforce development. Because to Başak's point, we need like hybrid anthropologists, community engagement practitioners, like technical experts. We need like all kinds of weird teams and specialized people. And I think that like broadly, we're not set up to do this at all as a sector. And so I'm hopeful and excited for what you all are going to be able to grow from here with regard to like just creating the spaces and giving folks the opportunities to prepare for this kind of work. Because it is, I think, you know, all three of my academic colleagues described sort of these pathways of having to find the different puzzle pieces sort of on their own, and then find different places to be supported or find each other. And like, it would be so cool if it just weren't so hard. Like if folks could be like, I'm interested in this, and then we could be like, great, we're going to be really supportive and like swoop you into a well-defined program with lots of mentorship and financial support. And so like, just, it shouldn't have to be an uphill battle for folks to prepare for some of these specialized needs. And I'm hopeful, based on just the whole conversation today and sort of the tea leaves of the changing politics and the work that you all are doing at your respective institutions, that we can start to make progress here.
Yeah, that's kind of a perfect segue to my next question, but I want to sort of repeat a couple of things I heard, what I think are important, right? In retrospect, it seems very odd, right? But we have traditionally set up R&D programs in the US where technologists, you're one group, go work over here. Security people, you're another group, go work over here. SDS type people, you're another group. Like, and there's no intersection in the Venn diagram. And you look backward and you're like, well, why did we do that? Right. The second, to your point about continuity, yeah, I've noticed over the years that I've been doing this that the nuclear community is very good at all lining up and flinging ourselves enthusiastically at something. It's GNAP, it's it's NGNP, it's whatever it is. And then we're very good at stopping on a dime, forgetting we were doing that and pivoting to something else. And so, one of my concerns, worries is that we'll get to the point where we're doing interesting work, and then we will decide that this was the thing that we had been doing and totally forget that we're doing this and fling ourselves someplace else, right? So it's not only establishing these intersections as an important research area for the US, but figuring out how to make sure that there's continuity for multiple years, not just it's the thing we're doing right now. But the question I bring then is sort of flip it from research to curriculum, right? You've also sort of hinted at you need a workforce that develops these people that have talent at the intersection of multiple skills. I don't think that's what the educational system looks like right now. So like, what's your sense of that pivot and how we do that and how we're thoughtful about it? And no particular order. And I promised the audience about roughly 20 minutes to get their questions. We've got a couple. All right, so we'll talk about this for the next 5-10 minutes, then we'll talk to the audience a bit. So yeah, Aditi, yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think, often when we ask that workforce question, Todd, we're just asking about the numbers, like where are the technicians, where are the engineers, where are the people we need, how do we get them? And that's not enough. That is not at all enough, because it's not just about the numbers. It's also about what skills are we missing? As you've just pointed out, we don't have an overlap in the Venn diagram. And often a lot of people we need to do the work that needs to be done, the skills that those people need to have are actually on the overlaps that have long been missing. And so we need new skills, but then we also have to ask, who has those skills? Who is at the table? Who makes up the nuclear field? For a long time, the sort of demographic represented in our field has been very narrow. It's been mostly male dominated, and it's been mostly white. There have been many efforts made by departments to change that demographic composition of the field. And these efforts have been well-meaning. I would like to say that they've been going on at least for the last decade, or maybe even a little bit more, at least in my department at MIT, where I was a student, they tried for a while. And that's admirable too. I know Michigan is trying as well. But it's not enough to work just to change the demographic composition of the field if you don't change the field itself. You can bring new people to it, but if their voices are not heard, if their contributions are not valued, they're not going to stay. And so I think we have to understand not just the gap in terms of the numbers that are missing, but who is missing, what skills and perspectives are missing. And if these people came to the field once and left it, what about the field made them leave? And those are the kinds of questions that we should be asking as we do not just curricular development, but also our DEI work. I mean, I think both of those things. But then also, these are not just questions to be asked in the context of educational policy or strategy, but these are research questions that we as nuclear engineers should be asking in partnership with our colleagues in the humanities and social sciences. And at least one piece of that, the part where those questions sort of transform our pedagogy, we then have to think about, if these are the skills that are missing, and if these are the ways in which the discipline is incomplete intellectually and epistemically, how do we fill those gaps in the discipline itself to make it potentially a more appealing field or sector that people will want to come to and want to be a part of? And I think in some ways this circles back to the piece that Denia and I wrote in Issues. What is it that we need to do to reimagine nuclear engineering? And at least part of that answer for us is that we need to bring in some of these ways of thinking about technology, thinking about science and engineering that our STS scholars have long been developing, that our sociology scholars have long been developing. People like Başak, how do we bring that to nuclear engineering? That doesn't mean that we have to be the experts on those topics. It doesn't have to mean that we teach all of those courses, but we can teach those courses with our colleagues in the humanities and social sciences. We can at least show our students that these are other lenses through which to look at the world. And I think those are the types of things that we need to be doing as we think about what the nuclear energy workforce of the future should look like.
Yeah. Any other comments on that?
I just want to rebound on what Aditi said. I think there's also this problem that, as social scientists, we often find ourselves in a situation that we are not understood and all these things. And I think there's a learning curve from both sides as well. So we mutually need to acknowledge that, there's work and efforts to be put. And if the questions are not the ones that we were expecting, or, it's not exactly what we thought we will be addressing in a meeting or in a, conversation, we also need to, as social scientists, acknowledge that we will need time and, mutual patience and interest in each other's perspectives so that we move forward. So.
Okay, any other comments on that? All right, Aditi and Başak, you said it so well that no more comments are necessary. Excellent. So let me just, I see two different questions some people are putting me in the chat, some in the Q&A. So the first one that I saw popped up was about science communications, saying for 2 decades, we've said that the things we talk about are what's a reactor, how does fission work, what's radiation, what does it mean to be radioactive? Should we be addressing different questions entirely? Should we be thinking about answers from a different angle? So it's more of a comms philosophy question. And if anyone wants to take that on. Hey, Suzy.
Yeah, I would say your audience knows the answer to this. What do they want to know? And it might be technical details or it might not. So I would say going in, you know your stuff if there are technical questions, but don't assume that is what is concerning folks. And so as much as possible, always ask them what they want to talk about or what their concerns are, and respond in kind.
Yeah, I think sometimes we assume too. I'll try not to give away the context, but I was part of a group talking to state legislators once. And there was some folks from a national lab who went so deep into the technical complexities of a recycle chemistry. And you just watched these legislators drift off to the other things they'd rather think about that day. I mean, it was just like the air left the room, right? So yeah, anyway.
In my experience doing community engagement work, if you just shut up and listen, you will learn so much about the histories of these communities and the conflicts that they've experienced, and the concerns that they have are almost never what I expect. I mean, I always come back to when I was doing work in South Carolina near the Savannah River National Lab. There was a group of equestrians, people who own and breed and ride horses, who felt that they weren't adequately engaged and formed this coalition against all kinds of projects. I mean, it was really wild. And it had to do with the sort of socioeconomic dynamics of the region and the sort of influx of new people and people with more money. And anyway, I just shut up and listened, and I didn't help them necessarily solve this problem, but it was very interesting to just find out what is going on here. And it has nothing to do with the technical issues of the research and development at the lab. So anyway, that's similar, Todd, to your experience of the politicians who, they don't want a technical analysis necessarily. Some might, but
yeah, Aditi.
I would also say that we can flip some of that inward. I think the science communicators can serve as a bridge. What are the questions that the communities are asking them, and can they bring those to the scientists and engineers, and I guess tell us what has been wrong about the ways in which we've been approaching society sort of writ large. And so I think science communicators can sort of function as that bridge, and I think that's a very important role that somebody needs to be playing, and they're the best group, I think, positioned to do that.
Yeah, Suzy, combining your comment about listening and our previous comment on our conversation on curriculum, I'm thinking that we need, in order to get your PhD, you need to get at least a B in the course, How to Be Humble. Like PhDs have to figure this out, right? Anyway.
I'll just add to that there's there's a very strong cultural component in the sort of science communication paradigm that I think is especially salient in the nuclear field, because the nuclear field, this is, feel free to disagree with me, but I mean, goes without saying, but the nuclear sector's history has been so steeped in secrecy, right? Alex Wellerstein's book talks about this a lot. It came out earlier this year, I think, or late last year. And because it has been steeped in secrecy and sort of, we've constructed this mystery and aura around nuclear knowledge that I think, and I'm going to skip a couple of steps here, I'm not going to kind of present the whole theory, but I think that what we see now reflected in specifically the nuclear engineering culture is this sort of epistemic superiority of nuclear knowledge. And that, I think, is one of the dimensions of this idea that that feeds into the deficit model, the nuclear knowledge deficit model. I'm totally making this up, but it's not just nuclear, but this whole concept around like, well, if only we explained radiation to them, or if only we said that bananas are radioactive too, then everything will be fine, right? And then we'll have a conversation, and then, but you know, as Başak was saying earlier, this is not how you necessarily find out what the needs of different, and what Suzy was saying about the equestrians, like this is not how you find out, this is not how you listen to the needs of the communities, to their viewpoints. This is not how you build consent. This is not how you do deliberative democracy, which is a whole other component of the engagement piece that we were talking about. So I think, and I'm not a science comms theorist, but just from having watched the sort of nuclear knowledge superiority complex unfolding in front of my eyes for many decades, you know, there's really something to be learned, I think, from not just humility, but I think the histories as well, so as to about why we're in this relationship with different parts of the public sphere to begin with, and why we don't understand ourselves as a nuclear community to be part of that public sphere.
All right, okay. Oh, Suzy, go ahead, please.
Just on the topic of like power dynamics in the space, a thing that I've experienced and continue to witness is that often the folks doing the engagement work on the ground with communities don't have the power to change the structures that they're operating in. So even if and when the community is saying this needs to be dealt with differently, this needs to change, this stakeholder group hasn't even been addressed, this stakeholder group is pissed, you know, and you're getting this great information, because there is still such hierarchy in the space culturally. Folks with this expertise, where they do exist and are skilled in the sector, they don't always have the ability to shift things in the way that would be appropriate in response to these inputs. So like that's a sort of like immediate term, like low hanging fruit kind of problem, which is that a lot of times this work is happening. It's just not being utilized appropriately.
Okay, let me transition to the second question. It's a little bit long, so I'll read it out. So imagine you're working at one of the 24 utilities that is pledged to get zero carbon emissions by 2050, and you're looking at some mix of wind, solar, hydro, nuclear, all the zero carbon technologies. What categories of questions would be most likely to elicit insightful, useful responses from the general public? Is it a choice between technology, a choice between small reactor, large reactor? Do you expect to get feedback on siting beyond NIMBY? Anyone want to say something to that?
I would say, Todd, that input needs to start before the siting stage. It needs to start at the design stage even, so that when you bring something to be sited somewhere, it already has accounted for the inputs from the community where it might potentially be sited. And this approach to design and engineering is not one that we've adopted in the past, but increasingly as our sources of energy become more distributed, including potentially nuclear reactors, and we don't know if we'll actually get there. You know, we have a lot of paper reactors now that are going through the design and even the licensing phases. We don't know if we'll get there, but in order to potentially get there, we need to bring in these perspectives much earlier on, not just at the siting phase, but actually at the design stage. And in my conversations with designers, reactor designers recently, I will tell you that they are very open to bringing in those perspectives very early on. And that is extremely heartening. We just have to figure out what channels to build to bring in those community perspectives at a relatively early stage of design and engineering. And actually that's a tool or a methodology or an approach to design that has been missing in the field that I think we can build now. And I think universities actually, such as our department, Todd, have a very important role to play in sort of redefining and reimagining how we do design and engineering.
Just to add quickly, I think we shouldn't expect, we shouldn't qualify answers from the general public as useful or unuseful. I mean, they are, there are responses, they are valuable, and, whether we find them useful in preliminary stage or not, we just need to hear them. And then I think it's also important to drop the labeling of some communities as not in my backyard or yes in my backyard. It's quite, these communities who have concerns have always been reduced to not in my backyard communities, which is, I think, perpetuating the problem. Yeah, it's not solving in any way to labeling some communities as either way. That's all I want to say.
Suzy.
Yeah, one thing that I hope we can normalize is the idea of a community saying no, whether it's to a waste facility or an energy facility. That's a success. Like, the sooner that a project stops moving forward because a community doesn't want it, the better, versus like pushing something through and escalating conflicts over time, and that always gets us in trouble. So I just, like, when we talk about what is a successful engagement outcome, a no could be a great answer. It means you're not dumping resources into something that's doomed, or something that gets built and then is just mired in conflict and problems for its entire life cycle. So just like, yeah, no is great.
Okay, so we have about 5 more minutes. So now we've got lots more questions that then we'll get to, but I think Aaron Ford's was next. What are the nuclear responsibility paradigms taught where you are? What are the preeminent net zero technologies available for commercial or government contract work? So I think 2 very different questions. I would say from Michigan Department of Nuclear Engineering, I don't think we teach this very well right now. Right, you've got mainly technology courses, right? We've been able to slide in a little bit on ethics, socially engaged design in the last couple of years, but I would say it's not done well, right? I think that's what's important about these conversations. I don't know, Aditi or Başak, I mean, you sit at universities too. You've sit recently at different universities. I'm curious to what you think. I think, and if they are taught like before, they're taught in separate bits. They're taught in humanities department, not in the engineering department.
I mean, I can say a bit, and then Başak can tell us about the new curriculum that she's developing at Manchester, I think. I will tell you that at MIT, there were quite a few courses in this area. There were courses on nuclear energy and society. There were courses on managing nuclear technology. But what I think was missing is that often this problem of engaging with society was over-intellectualized, in that we were bringing in these frameworks often from political science or from sociology to think about the technologies, which was a great thing to be doing. But, we were sort of making that leap from technology to save the world too soon, missing all of the steps in between, missing the things that we've been talking about for the last hour. And so I think it's important to have that in the pedagogy. And I hope that that's where we're headed, Todd, at least at NERS. I mean, I think we have this great opportunity to design a lot of that from the ground up. And that's one of the things that I'm very excited to do, honestly. And I know Başak is already doing these things, so we should hear from her.
So we are creating a course on called Nuclear Science and Engineering as Social Practice, and it will be taught to both anthropologists and nuclear engineers. And the aim of the course is to show that historical, cultural, moral, political, regulatory, socio-economic frameworks in which scientific and technological knowledge is made and how this affects and produces society. And so we will be discussing about moralities and economies in the nuclear field. We will be talking about how engineering, about engineering energy infrastructures, about non-Western epistemologies, technophilia and technophobia, and about future imaginaries and how futures have been imagined from science fiction to anthropology and all these fields. So the purpose of the course is to open up the perspective of nuclear engineers to social sciences, and to make social scientists more aware of the questions that are raised by nuclear industry, and hopefully to have a nice cohort of people, a group of people who are, a hybrid group of people who will raise very different questions and will generate very different kinds of conversations collectively.
All right, so I think, so we only have 2 minutes to go. I want to respect the time that we asked of people. So I think we'll quit there. I apologize to all the folks in the audience who had teed up another question that we didn't get to. So maybe this is interesting enough that we'll do it again sometime, right? Maybe once Jessica's back up and we can get all 5 people talking, and that'd be fun to do, see if we're making any progress. So I want to thank the audience for joining us. Definitely want to thank the panelists for for writing the piece. Right. We'll see if the fact that all these got published at the same time is kind of a Martin Luther moment for the nuclear engineering community. Right. But I appreciate that you did it, and I appreciate that you're out there talking about it. I think that's good. And I think I'll just close. I'm gonna follow something you said earlier, Aditi. I had been asked to give a talk on career development, something. And I was thinking about the last 5-10 years in nuclear energy and how much the conversation is changing in technology space, but in other ways. And I was trying to figure out how to capture that in like a single image, right? And weirdly, what I just came up with was like a whole bunch of pictures of women, right? And I think what's important about that is like, it's different voices, it's looking at the problem different, and it's actually moving us forward. And so I'm glad that we convened this panel. I think more panels like this are important to going forward. And it's also conveniently convinced me that I should accelerate my retirement, right? I'm at that point where I need to like move along. There are important people who should be heard, and that's you. So thank you for doing that. I appreciate it. No, anyway, and yeah, let's do it again. And folks in the audience, if you liked it, didn't like it, let us know. I'd be glad to keep the conversation going. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. See ya. Bye.